So another spin-off from the financial services industry where there's real, practical optimism, and also one that leads into, which I know is always a burning issue in any room, is the labor and immigration issues on the one hand, and more generally, the public infrastructure reforms that we may, or that we recommended to implement. In 5 to 10 years, where should they be? What will they look like? What will the public infrastructure of the BVI look like, Jerry, in terms of labor and immigration? We know you've given this quite a bit of thought. How much can you tell us?
I suppose that last question is the critical one. And I say that from two perspectives, two hats that I'm wearing, so to speak. But let us be realistic and let us be frank. Labor and immigration issues loom very large in terms of the future growth and prosperity of the territory and the development of the various sectors of the economy. As I mentioned in answer to the first question I was asked, this is an issue in particular which cuts across the entire economy. It's not just financial services. And indeed, any approach which is just simply confined to financial services is going to create a certain problems and certain backlash, I believe, within the wider community. So the approach, and as has been mentioned, I was named as the sponsor of this particular initiative as recommended in the McKinsey report. I would hasten to add, I was given this task when I was absent from a meeting. So that tells you something. You must attend if you want to make sure you're not given into these kind of things. But in all seriousness, the approach of our committee was a very broad-based approach to look at what it means to facilitate rather than to obstruct, and to put unnecessary procedures and problems, or to keep unnecessary procedures and problems in place. Procedures and problems that in the final analysis don't really do anything constructive, but are very discouraging in terms of the development of business and various industries and sectors of the economy. So the recommendations which have come out of the report, the approach was to make a series of recommendations that would cut across all of the various sectors of the economy, and if implemented by government, would hopefully benefit and facilitate the development of those sectors. And then we also looked at specific sectors and specific recommendations in relation to those sectors, including, of course, financial services, the tourism sector, the yachting, the marine sector, the construction sector, et cetera, et cetera. Those recommendations are in a report which has been submitted, and I believe is shortly to be considered by Cabinet. What has taken place is to look at the totality of the recommendations and to divide them into those that can be implemented immediately and with very little cost and other difficulties, those that are more for the midterm, and those that are perhaps for the long term. In order for any of these recommendations to have any chance of success, they must be underpinned by government policy. And so there is a need for certain policy decisions to be made in relation to each of those recommendations, regardless of which category they fall into. And those policies have to be made and developed as they relate specifically to government and ultimately the country's approach to the various sectors of the economy, the needs, the concerns, the issues that have been raised and have been put in the McKinsey report, coming from the feedback that has been received, and how best these can be addressed. Ultimately, with one word in mind: facilitation. Facilitation. Because too often the perception is that we are not facilitating, we are making it unnecessarily difficult in many ways to do business in the territory and to attract investment to the territory. And that is something obviously that we have to address, something that we have to be very, very concerned about. So I am reasonably hopeful and optimistic, Dawn, that a number of these recommendations will ultimately be taken on board and will be implemented. I must also add that one of the key recommendations is to conflate, to bring all the various applications under one regime, and indeed one application. So that while now you have to fill out an application for work permit, you have to fill out an application for any other approvals that you need in order to finally sit at a desk and do some work. We've made recommendations that hopefully will simplify the system, address the inefficiencies in the system, and cut down on the lag time between application and approval. We've also taken a look at, from an investment point of view, some of the things that need to be done in order to attract foreign investment. And we've looked at one or two of the initiatives which the government had already taken a look at in some shape or form, and we have commented and made recommendations that we hope will improve upon those initiatives, and ultimately we anticipate that once decisions have been made, we'll begin to see the results of those recommendations. Important to all of this, and someone else has touched on it before, is capacity building, the development particularly of local talent and ability in all sectors of the economy. We speak again of financial services, but really again in relation to all sectors of the economy. And this is not just from the perspective of employment, the question of middle and upper level management positions, but this is also from the perspective of ownership of businesses within those major sectors of the economy, and the question of how that should be facilitated. Lorna will speak, I believe, a lot more to that in her presentation. But again, as part and parcel of any policy in relation to immigration and labor, we must factor in local talent development and local participation development in those sectors, and how do we what type of policies we should have in place that would assist in ensuring that that development can take place. And so the way I see this really is that immigration and labor is there sort of like an umbrella at the bottom holding up most of the economy really, because the kind of confidence that we must have and continue to have and must continue to foster in relation to all sectors of the economy is directly related to what we do in immigration and labor. There's one other thing I would mention, and that relates to the categories or classes of immigrants and work permits. And this is something in which, about which we have made recommendations, specific recommendations. Right now we have, perhaps one could describe it as 2 or 3 broad classes or categories. We are a much more sophisticated economy than that. And there is a need for work permits, entry visas, whatever we choose to call it, that are specific to particular categories, where people would have some degree of certainty as to what their entitlements and benefits are when they are granted that permit, and what, most importantly as well, are the restrictions or limitations as well. Certainty is important, and that ties into the whole question of how long or what period should work permits be for. And we've made recommendations in relation to that as well, to say that in many instances, again underpinned by government policy as to how government sees the economy developing, that we should have work permits for 3 and for 5 months in certain, 3 and 5 years, sorry, in certain instances. There are those persons who have, somebody mentioned this earlier, who own property in the BVI. It cannot be, it's a nonsense to have a situation where people have expended considerable sums of money in acquiring property, in acquiring businesses and developing businesses in the territory, and we are telling them that you can only have a permit to remain in the country for 6 months. What signal are we sending when we do that? It's certainly not one of confidence in the economy, and that needs to change, and we have made certain recommendations in relation to that. In particular, we have persons who are, just homeowners who have gone through a process of vetting and approval by government when they were granted their landholding license and so on. Why should those persons be limited to 6 months entry? Why should they have to leave and come back? Those persons should really be encouraged to stay as long as possible in their homes in the BVI, and the spin-off benefits to the economy would be far greater than discouraging them from spending more than 6 months of the year here in the BVI. So these are just some of the areas that we have touched on in terms of the recommendations. The initiative is at the stage, as I said before, where we have now identified and categorized in terms of timing the recommendations, and I believe very shortly Cabinet will have this matter for their consideration, and we look forward to learning what recommendations have been approved. One other point, as it occurs to me, much of these recommendations will require changes in the law, and that is something that has to take place. The Immigration and Passport Act, the Labor Code, etc., etc. So that's another area in which we have to address. But certainly in relation to the recommendations that can be implemented in the short term, those would not of necessity require changes in the law. The use of technology is part of the recommendations that we have made very forcefully. We hope ultimately this will take some time to be able to move to a situation where you could actually make your applications online. They can be processed and communicated online. And that is not just in relation to work permits for the financial services industry or even for the tourism industry, but it relates to other areas where government has to give permits, such as the yachting industry, the marine industry, etc., etc. So that is crucial, but the development of the systems, the technological systems, and putting those in place and making sure that they work in the way in which they are intended to work, not like, for example, when Obamacare was rolled out. We don't want that happening when we roll out our electronic system of for applications and approvals. So again, these are just, Dawn, some of the
recommendations.
Yeah.
Very useful. I actually got more than I expected. Thank you very much, Jerry. Now, Lorna, I'm going to put you between questions, which I want to open the floor. There's lots more that we can say here, but we really do want to hear from you. And energy, innovation, and agility. Greg made those points. That's where we need to be. Jerry indicated we're supposed to be making strides in that direction. Do you have anything to add to that?
Oh yes, I thank you, Dawn. I cannot stress enough the whole point that Jerry made about certainty, the importance of certainty as it relates to not just immigration and labor, but government must create in people's minds certainty. The example that Simon gave this morning of people coming here and having to have a temporary work permit. When they're virtually the owners of the company, we must make a decision and be clear about it. Certainty, I think Ed also gave the example about renting. And again, there is this uncertainty as to who can own and who can rent and so on. The government must give this kind of certainty.
Communication.
And as Ed said, it's very good to be able to talk to the government sitting there. The governor is there, the premier, the deputy premier, and others in the room. There must not only be certainty. Sometimes I wonder whether we, in fact, not sometimes I wonder, we need a population policy. Is 30,000 ideal? Is an ideal number? Should we be moving to another number? For instance, the Premier talked about what keeps him awake at night, as Russell asked. 260 students leaving high school every year. A lot of them want to get into business. Would 30,000 inhabitants make for a viable business? These are things that we ought to be looking at. Should we be going up to 40, 50, 60,000 over a 10-year, 20-year period? The government needs to be planning now. This is what post-McKinsey is about. I think Jerry touched on the clear areas, the areas of investment. Certainly what the Premier said about the announcement he made yesterday was very good in terms of getting people here to the BVI. And we need to have less bureaucracy in government. We talk about it, we come here every year, Russell, and we talk about it, and we still have more and more bureaucracy. I had an example only last week where a person working in one of our leading accounting and financial services firms nearly left the country, not because of him and his work permit, but because of his wife and his child. There was some silly regulation. It wasn't even a regulation, it was an arbitrary point made. And the wife said, I am leaving, and the husband said, well, I have to go too.
He has to. He has to go, absolutely.
You know, we have to stop this level of arbitrariness in government and get serious. I have lived in Hong Kong. I have lived in London. I have lived in several places all over the world. I've lived in the United States, and I have never been subjected to the level of arbitrariness that is in the British Virgin Islands government. It has to stop, and the leaders are here, and the leaders need to make the point to the persons who work for them that they have to stop it. And there's a lot more that I want to say, but as you say, we need to open it up because I'm sure other people have points.
Have lots to say. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, the takeaway from this conference will be that beyond McKinsey, there will be no more bureaucracy in government.
But we don't want to go that far.
No more.
We'll see where it takes us when we come for 2026, Russell. So we're going to open the floor now to questions.
Comments and feedback.
And what? Oh, somebody has a question. I wanted to respond to something.
Should be on.
I just wanted to, it's kind of an observation, but also possibly something that can be addressed. Oftentimes when you promote a specific sector, and so you develop your investment promotion in that specific sector, immigration and labor laws has to be adapted, because it would be giving mixed signals that you're inviting me in, you do put a big chunk of investment in that specific activities, which is promoting that sector. And then once you get an investor coming in, that you would be basically subjecting them to many regulations, many arbitrary decisions. So based on the sectors that are identified, even within your own financial sector or within the tourism sector, at this point, you can tailor-make some of the legislation by just using policy development, and that would help. So it doesn't mean a general over-the-line type of adapting, but it can adapt certain of the legislation by policy.
Very true.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that observation. We'll move on to another question, and if the panelists wish to address it while we deal with the other one. Jack?
Thank you. Yeah, if I could say that a lot of the times, I think the civil service come in for a lot of criticism. Some of it is unnecessary. I think the civil servants generally are very, very helpful. They work under policies and under laws that haven't been changed. So they're expected to do innovative things, allow people to come in and breach sometimes of the law and the regulations. So the chief immigration officer will tell his staff, this is not to happen. And the next day a company comes up and the law says you have to be, or the policy says you have to be outside of the territory while you change your permit or whatever, and then he has to change it. So a lot of times I think is the fact that the House or Cabinet needs to change the rules to give the civil servants the ability to do what everybody wants them to do. My second point is this, that there's an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that a lot of pushback comes because people feel that the employers are not doing their part on the other side. Here we are allowing people to do this and come in and get all the time, but yet the employers are not doing the same thing. And until that happens, I think whatever law you pass, until that happens, until people feel that there is evenness on both sides. Many functions I go to, there's not one single local person, none. Like, I mean, in court, Mr. Ferrara is now the commercial court judge, so there's one. But apart from that, they're not. And I'm saying that until these things change, until employers take a different view about a lot of things, whatever law you pass is the same effect is going to happen. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you, Jack. Would anybody like to respond to those two observations? Or would somebody else like to ask another question? Because it's our conversation. Oh, yes. Well, the Honorable Premier would like to speak. Whenever he wishes. That's what happens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the matter of immigration and labor, I know that the Mr. Ferrara, Honorable, Your Excellency, I don't know what to call you, has worked very hard with the various sectors and it made a draft report, I'm actually awaiting a cabinet paper so it can be taken to cabinet. It's taken a little while to get to me, but I'm going to ask that it be speeded up. But I've just had a word with the Minister of Labor, and we have agreed that the Minister of Labor and the Minister of Immigration will get together before this week is out with the respective heads of immigration and labor and review that proposal so we can sort it out once and for all, so we don't have to come back next year.
Good. 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 So something came out of the conference
Government on the move.
other than talking.
But if I may just say something briefly,
Sure.
and that is very encouraging, Honorable Premier. And I think this goes to the point which Mr. Husbands was making about changing laws and so on. You can change laws and yes, the law is there, but you really don't bring about any serious change that gives you the desired results. And to some extent, there's a need for a change in the culture of government. And by that terminology, I use it in its broadest sense, including members of the public service, of course. And to Jack's point, I mean, there are many instances that I can personally point to where I have had very good service over the years, and Don, I have many years under my belt, apparently, members of the public service. But there is a need for a change in the way of thinking and approach. And that's why I use the word facilitation, because one of the things I think we all have to understand in the territory, whether we work in the public sector or the private sector, essentially, in my mind, we are part of one economy, one overall sector, where what we do in one sector can have either a beneficial or detrimental effect in the other. And that works equally well in the private sector, because again, in the private sector is all well and good for us to have the laws and so on that facilitate business, but then if we attract the wrong type of business and we don't do something to change that, then we can have a very detrimental effect on the overall image of the BVI and hence the economy of the territory. So whether we work in one sector or the other, we have to appreciate that each of us have a role to play, and how we play that role, how we conduct ourselves, can be either positive or negative. And we need really, as I said, to move to a culture of facilitation. But we must know what we are to facilitate. And in order for us to know what we are to facilitate, it's not just simply a matter of having laws in place, but these things must be underpinned by sound government policy that is known. And once policy is known, you begin to create certainty. I mean, I might not like the policy, and the certainty for me might be that I'm not going to get involved. But if I'm going to get involved, it's important for me to have that level of certainty, because especially if I'm going to be investing capital in what I'm doing, and I'm putting my capital at risk. The worst thing you want to have happen to you from an investor point of view or from a business point of view is where the unknown hits you. Things that were not brought to your attention, or even things that did not exist at the time when you made your decision to invest, that now adversely affect your investment, and perhaps you would not have made that decision or not have invested in the way in which you did had you known those things. Those sort of unwritten things that pop up from time to time. We must minimize this to a large extent, reduce bureaucracy. We're not going to eliminate bureaucracy ever. You know, it's going to be part of our life. It's just going to be there. But these are some of the things that we need to address, so that in order for us to bring our public service or whatever along, the members of the public service, they must understand and know the policy, and the policy must be articulated and publicly known to all concerned so that everyone can step in line, so to speak.
Thank you very
Good.
much, Jerry. I believe His Excellency also had
Comment?
an observation to make, and then we are
Gonna go
just
to,
about out of time, and then I'll just make a few
Okay.
closing remarks.
and then we're going to go to Chad.
We can move on to Chad, Mr. Mystery, who I
Switched on?
didn't have an
Yeah, switched
opportunity
on.
to engage very much, but you have your turn.
Thank
Your
you. Just
Excellency.
very, very quickly, since we've been challenged in the front row, and the Premier has responded. I think the great thing about the McKinsey report is it provides structure and focus, and I look forward to reading Jerry's committee's report. I think you can take it as read that we're all on the same page in this room. We want to move forward, we want that flexibility. But as Jerry also said, you're also looking at the three key members of the National Security Council. And we have to, between us, manage the security aspects, as you said, of opening up the territory, facilitating all those new things that we should be doing, such as modeling ESTAs, for example. If you go to the United States, UK citizen, you just go online, you do it, it's done. But that has to be balanced with security, and we've been having that conversation in the 16 months that I've been here. We've also conscious, with respect to the person who spoke from the back of the room, the problem of customer service. And I've done some mystery shopping by turning up at immigration and not telling anybody who I am in the early days. And it wasn't good enough. And I have had the head of immigration in my office the following day to explain that that's not going to happen like that again. So we're conscious of the problems and the challenges. And as I say, I think McKinsey and this debate have given us a sort of focus that we as decision makers need in order to go to the place that all of us want to get to. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have
Final thoughts,
I-
Don?
one.
I'd just like to say one of the things that we are overlooking in a small community such as this, where BVI Islanders feel a bit outnumbered, we must also work to make them feel comfortable with the influx. Because a lot of times it's because they feel intimidated or they feel outnumbered or whatever the case may be. It's not because they necessarily don't want to serve, but we need some efforts for cultural integration and to make BVI Islanders likewise feel as comfortable as we work to make people coming in feel comfortable as well.
I know the time is gone, but I have to say something. I agree with you, Portia, on that in principle, but it comes back to the point of certainty. People should know, should understand what their rights are, what their privileges are, so they don't feel, intimidated, as you put it. If they know, I accept it in principle, but a lot of it comes down to the uncertainty and people sort of just guessing what should and what shouldn't happen. It doesn't work.
And
Good.
really, it's what I'm summing up now is that the main takeaway from our panel is going to be, in addition to the fact that we have a very bright future ahead, if we stay on the right track, is that key to that moving in that direction is clarity, communication, and understanding all around. And beyond McKinsey, that should really put us in very good stead. I'd like to thank my panelists for being here and for introducing you to the various topics, and also to you, the audience, for your questions, cooperation, and of course, your good behavior throughout.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.